Welcome to Graphite Hub's interview series, a series dedicated to all things graphite. Today, we're joined by Tom Burkett, founder of Global Graphite Advisory, and is a well-known and seasoned expert in the carbon and graphite space. So, welcome, Tom. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Harry. Appreciate being here.
Cool. So, yeah, I guess you're quite a well-known figure in the industry, but for those that might not be as familiar with you and your background, could you just maybe share a bit of an overview of your career so far in the kind of graphite and carbon space?
Okay. Yeah, I've got as you can see from my gray hair, I've been around a while. I've got 46 years in the carbon and graphite industry. I started with Union Carbide Carbon Products Division a week after I graduated from university, and so I started there. Union Carbide Carbon Products eventually became UCAR and now is known as GrafTech. So I spent about 23 years essentially at GrafTech, working in the operations side first, and then going into the technical support side, and then going into sales and marketing for the balance of my career at GrafTech. Um, and so I did that. I essentially worked mainly in the U.S. for them at first. Then I went overseas. I was working and covering the Asian market. Then I moved my family to Switzerland and spent about 3 years in Switzerland. I was in charge of sales and marketing for Europe, Africa, and Asia. And I had both sales, marketing, and technical service reporting into me there. So I had more than half the world for them at that point in terms of the graphite electrode business. Um, then I left GrafTech. I had my own company for a couple of years, and then I joined SGL Carbon, who at the time was the world's largest carbon and graphite company. And I went to China for them to start up a joint venture in the natural graphite space. Um, so I did that for a couple of years, starting up the joint venture, and it was a very interesting experience. And we were able to start the joint venture up, and it was profitable within the first year. So that was I'll say a feather in my cap. And then I was transferred back over to Germany, and I became president of the natural graphite division. And I had the plant in China, the joint venture in China, reporting into me, but I also had a plant in Germany and a plant in the U.S. And so I did that for a few years, and then I transferred with SGL back to the U.S. To the U.S. headquarters, and I was vice president of the GMS business area, graphite materials and systems business area. And I had here in the States, I had 5 plants, about 500 people, and about 150 million in P&L responsibility, and covered North and South America in that role. Then I left SGL and I became CEO of Ontario Graphite, which is a brownfield natural graphite mine north of Toronto, and spent about 4 years there moving that toward a restart and working on taking the company public and financing. And as we'll probably talk later, the price of natural graphite can be very fickle, and as a result, we struggled to take the company public. And so after about 4 years, I left Ontario Graphite and I became executive vice president of SANGRAF International, which was a U.S. headquartered uh, graphite electrode company that had a plant in China and a plant in Italy. And I joined them as executive vice president of operations, sales, and marketing. And my task there was to restart the plant. It was an old SGL plant in Italy. Was to restart that plant and then grow the company. And so over the 4 years I was there, we took the company from about 2,000 tons of sales up to about 25,000 tons of sales. And after 4 years, I decided it was time to retire. And so I retired about 3 years ago. And then I've been consulting ever since. As I like to joke, my wife says that I have failed retirement miserably because I'm consulting and working pretty heavily all the time in the graphite space. And
Yep.
that's really a function of the growth of both EAF steel, but also the growth of EV batteries and the work that's going on there. So
Well,
that's a
yeah,
short synopsis of my career.
yeah, no, it definitely kind of sounds like you've had quite a long and kind of respected career in the graphite industry. So it's great to be able to chat with someone that has your level of experience. But maybe let's jump into a bit more detail around kind of what you're doing now. So yeah, would you mind just maybe talking about what you kind of do at Global Graphite Advisory?
Yeah, yeah. I spend, I'll say probably about 50% of my time I spend advising clients on the state of the steel and the graphite electrode industry and on the graphite anode space for batteries, and a little bit of that time also on coke and pitch. To make graphite, coke is the main ingredient, but you also need pitch. The pitch that typically is used today is coal tar pitch, which has some real downsides to it. So I'm working with some people on I'll say the new and improved petroleum pitch that I think will help the industry long term. And then I do some advising for people on mergers and acquisitions and expansions if they're doing that within the space. So that's kind of where I spend my time talking to analysts about where certain companies are going in the state of the steel industry and the EV industry, and helping people that are trying to make decisions on expansion, make decisions on starting new mines, make decisions on mergers and acquisitions. So that's a lot of my time that
Yeah.
I spend. So
Yeah, that sounds like you're keeping quite busy. So yeah, maybe let's
yes,
jump into the graphite industry. So we're kind of seeing like quite a few graphite projects, in the exploration and development stage, and even a number that are in production. Yet we're still seeing quite a few issues in the sector. So when you kind of look at the kind of current demand projections and kind of market forecasts for graphite, I guess how much confidence do you have in these and the accuracy of these kind of projections, and kind of where do you kind of realistically see the graphite market heading kind of over the next few years?
well, the way I look at the graphite market, a lot of people get very focused on the EV market. I look at it in what I call kind of the three legs of the graphite stool. One is batteries, which is obviously driven by the EV industry, steel, which is driven by graphite electrodes, and the one that most people don't think about is aluminum. Aluminum is a huge consumer of graphite because they need both graphite cathodes and graphite anodes for the Hall cell process, the primary graphite or primary aluminum process. So I kind of look at the world that way because I need to understand, is aluminum going up and down? Is steel going up and down? And is the EV industry going up and down? Because they all play a pretty big role in the I'll say the global demand. When you look at aluminum, aluminum's been relatively slow over the past couple of years. The world had projected it was going to grow at about a 4% rate. It has not been at 4% for the last couple of years. It's been a little bit slower than that, but it's so large that even a 1% uptick in aluminum can cause a big consumption of coke, and therefore a big consumption in terms of graphite and pitch. Uh, on the steel side, steel has globally has started to convert over toward EAF steel, away from integrated steel and toward EAF steel. And there's a simple reason for that. EAF steel has about a 75% reduction in CO2 compared to integrated. So people are trying to do that. What you see in China is that integrated steel is continuing to run, but the new growth and capacity in China is generally speaking going to come from EAF. And for the most part, around the world, that's true. You're going to see EAF steel as the growth side of steel as opposed to integrated. Then batteries, obviously, that's the big kicker because of the growth rates it's been having. So if you go back about 5 years ago, the demand for battery grade graphite anodes was about 100,000 tons. Today, that's moving toward 3 million tons. So it's really been, I'll say, astronomical growth that we've seen over the past 5, 6 years in the battery side. So that's what's really propelled the demand on the graphite side. EAF steel is growing at, let's call it 3, 4%. Aluminum might be growing at 1, 2%, but batteries have been growing early days, they were growing at 50%. Now they're probably going to be more like I'll say a little more toward a normal growth curve, but it's still going to be north of 10% would be my expectation for a while. Obviously, there's different things that go on in terms of geopolitical situations and stuff like that. And obviously, there's a lot of up and down right now with the global markets that is making the picture kind of hazy, but there's still this move toward electric vehicles. It's very strong in China, it's very strong in Europe, and it's actually been picking up steam here in North America. One of my friends was talking about how EVs were not growing at these great rates, and I said, well, no, they're not, but they still grew 25% last year. I said, there's nobody in the world that wouldn't like to have a 25% growth rate. The issue the car companies have is if they plan for 50% and it only grows at 25%, everybody feels like that's a terrible thing. And it is obviously if you've invested capital, but that means you now have to pull back a little bit on your expectations, but you're still looking at, and I think the car companies are still looking at EVs as where the future is. So I don't see that change really dampening the overall growth of graphite. It's just going to be in some cases it might not be quite as fast as people had expected. EAF steel, for example, we had really expected it would grow a little bit faster, but the overall steel industry has been tamped down for the last couple of years and not really had quite the growth we had expected. And there's other, I'll say, market forces that are coming to bear on the graphite electrode industry as far as that goes, with new entrants coming in from China, from India, so that you see a little bit more competitive situations out in the markets that maybe not you don't see here in the States as much, but certainly in Europe, South America, Middle East, even in Southeast Asia, there's a lot more what I would call competitive markets out there. So that's when I look at the markets, that's kind of where I see things going, and that's how I spend a lot of my time now, looking at markets, trying to understand and put forecasts together for people for long-term planning. I do a lot of one-off discussions with people, similar to this, where I talk about where I think the markets are going for both buy side and sell side analysts. And then I do some due diligence now for lenders, because there's a lot of questions that people have about, okay, they want to borrow $200 million from us and for this project. Is this project going to be viable? So I help people understand the economics of the project so they can look at them and make informed decisions on whether or not it's a good place to lend their money.
Yeah. Okay. And I guess yeah, maybe on the note of the kind of the future of the market, we kind of do see a kind of an ongoing debate. It comes up all the time around synthetic versus natural graphite. So I guess how do you kind of view the kind of evolving split between synthetic and natural graphite kind of going forward?
Yeah, if you look back a few years, go back 5 years in the true infancy of the market, it was kind of about 50-50 because the cost to produce synthetic anodes was quite high.
Yep.
And so you have this yin and yang, this push and pull of price versus quality versus variability. And so when people were looking at natural graphite, they're looking at that saying, okay, it's cheaper than synthetic. So maybe we'll use more natural. And then they started looking at the variation that they saw, the variability in natural. And you have to understand when we're talking EVs, we're really talking automotive. We're talking automotive companies, car companies. And car companies have, if there's one thing they truly hate, that's variability. And so the automotive guys have gravitated now more over to synthetic as the cost has come down. There's more coke available, and they've done some things to try and get their costs down. It still causes a problem for them from a environmental standpoint because it's not as green as a natural product. But what I see today is we've kind of moved to around 70% synthetic, 30% natural, and people are blending those. And so I kind of see that as the long-term structural setup. It's going to be somewhere a little bit heavier on the synthetic than on the natural. The other one that's moving in now is a lot of work that people are doing on silicon anodes, and I'll call them silicon carbon anodes because there's nobody that I'm aware of that you hear people talking about silicon anodes. They're not pure silicon. What they're using silicon with graphite. And so typically what you're seeing is silicon can be substituted for the graphite anode up to around 10%. So you're going to have about 90% graphite and about 10% silicon. Once you get above 10%, it becomes very difficult because of the expansion of the silicon. Silicon accepts lithium ions much better than graphite, much more ions, but with that capacity to accept more, it expands and it causes a problem with expansion and contraction of the anode material. So what I think you're going to see long term, this is my view, is call it 70-30 split between the synthetic and the natural graphite, and silicon will creep in and take about 10% of that total. And so, maybe it's 65, 25, and 10 is kind of where things may shake out as far as that goes, because that 10% of silicon gives you a boost in the performance, both charging and discharging and capacity gives you a boost in the performance of the battery. So that's why people are so interested in getting that. And it's for the most part, it's a straight substitution. You take 10% graphite out, put 10% silicon in. It depends on how you do it, but you put that in, and now you've increased the performance of the battery. And you have to be a little careful on the expansion to make sure you're not causing structural issues inside the battery. But that to me is kind of where I see the battery anode business long term today.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, no, I think that the 70-30 split does seem to be kind of the general kind of theme I'm hearing as well. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah. So then when we kind of look at kind of graphite projects globally, either in the exploration or development stages, what kind of regions do you think are going to play kind of a key role um, in the future of graphite production, but then also kind of in the more downstream processing as well?
Well, obviously, there's one word you have to think about as you go through trying to understand projects and where things are and what's going to happen in the future. And that one word is geopolitical. And we see that playing out right now with I'll say the tariff wars that have begun with the discussions between the U.S. and Canada and Mexico, with the discussions between U.S. and Europe, the discussions now between Europe, U.S. and China. So there's a huge upheaval in the overall market. And I think the world markets have recognized that when it comes to rare earth, when it comes to lithium, when it comes to graphite, that they really don't want to be dependent on China for all of their 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 materials. And as we sit here today, China has control of about 90% plus or minus of the graphite going into batteries. And it's not just that they own the graphite, because they don't own all the graphite, but they own most of the processing of converting that graphite into anodes. And so there's a big push now in the US, there's a big push in other parts of the world to try and address that from a processing standpoint. Here in North America, we've got Syra, Australian listed company with a mine in Mozambique, but they have a processing facility to convert everything to anodes here in the States. Their capacity is small still, but it's growing. We've got Westwater here in the States. We've got other natural graphite guys that are starting to come through, and their processing capability would allow them to process not just natural, but also synthetic. So there is a growth of process capacity coming that will help the domestic industry here. There's efforts underway in Europe as well to try and get that. There's also, when you look at what's called the FEOC rules and regulations, people are moving. Even the Chinese are moving. They've built a plant for processing in Indonesia now to move out from underneath of the made in China umbrella. They're building a plant in Morocco. So there's a lot of effort underway now, both by, I'll say, Western suppliers, but also by the Chinese to try and spread the risk and spread the capability out around the world. And I think that's going to be good for the industries as far as that goes. The question then becomes is how do the governments handle that? And if you put large tariffs on things coming from China, and now the stuff goes through Indonesia and goes through Morocco, are we now going to have also larger tariffs coming on the material coming in from those places? That's yet to be seen, and better, we'll find out better as we move through the next, 18 to 24 months.
Yeah, and no, as you kind of say, the current geopolitical kind of situation is putting critical minerals kind of in the spotlight. So I think from an investor's
Yes, for
perspective,
sure.
and companies are kind of actively kind of trying to figure out how they can kind of tap into this space, particularly, as demand for batteries materials continues to rise. So I guess what factors should companies, investors kind of prioritize when they're evaluating, potential graphite projects, companies? Yeah, what's your thoughts there?
Well, I think that, and that's where I sometimes get hired on due diligence because people want to understand, it could be they want to understand the graphite market as far as that goes, but when you really get down the to the brass tacks, so to speak, as people are building processing plants and they're putting in capacity, some of this stuff is not what I'll call rocket science, but some of it's fairly new technology. And they want to understand if it's new or novel technology, is it going to work? Or is there somebody else who's it's novel, but it's not brand new? Is the capacity they're putting in, is it going to work? Has it been done someplace else before? Is it similar? Is it doomed to failure, or does it look like a very promising process? So those are the kind of things that I think people really have to focus on. You can look at the forecast and you can try and guess the future. I mean, everybody tries to do that, and you need to get a few different opinions about it. But they'll have to make up their own mind on whether or not the future market size is truly going to be there. And then once they've determined that they think the market can handle it, then they have to look at the the place they're going to put their money, the project they want to put their money in. How quickly can it come to market? And do they have the right people? Do they have the right technology? And what have they done in terms of planning for the overall project? Because that's one of the things I see people when they get into this, they're planning on making graphite anodes. And so they've got grand plans, but then when you sit down with them and go through the nuts and the bolts, there's a lot of gaps. And they need, in some cases, I've helped people understand what their gaps are and help them learn what they need to do and how to address that.
Yeah.
And those are the kind of things I think that anybody investing in a project wants to make sure they get some good advice into that, for that project about how well is it organized? How well is it structured? What is the cost structure they're going to have at the end? Because anybody can build a a project, whether it be a processing plant or it be a graphite mine. But if at the end of the day, the world is going to be looking at graphite, for $3,000 a ton, in flake or in the synthetic form before you make it into into an anode, and your costs are higher than that, you need to really understand how are you going to get your cost structure down. Some people just upsize the project so that they can, theoretically drive the cost down. But that, to me, that's a little nonsensical. You got to make sure that it's realistic what you're looking at. To start from zero and say you're going to build, you've never built a plant before, and you're going to build 100,000 ton plant is a little far-fetched. The Chinese are building 100,000 ton plants, but they've been operating plants now for literally 5, 6 years. So they understand what they need to do. They've been incrementally improving their technology.
Yeah, no, I think it's kind of there's a saying you need to walk before you can run, and I think with some of these companies out there, they do put out these projections around kind of what they're going to be doing, and as you say, they
Well,
can be quite far-fetched.
yeah. When you see a high growth market, everybody wants to get in, and there is a point that the first mover advantage is where you want to be. You don't want to come in as the 10th guy in the market. And when you look regionally, if you're sitting here looking at North America, right now there's a couple synthetic projects that are underway, and there's a couple of natural projects that are underway, and there's a couple of natural processing plants that are underway. I think the market over the near to medium term can support those with no problem. But now that you've got, if you kind of look at that and say, well, there's kind of 6 or 7 projects, that's good for the next 5 to 10 years. But if all of a sudden 4 or 5 more projects are are trying to get financed and and come into work, that becomes a question about whether or not those guys are going to have the ability to get into the market where they need to. So they need to have very good plans. They need to be talking to people about offtake agreements and things like that to make sure that they have what they need on the demand side before they start putting money in the ground.
Yeah. Okay. That is, yeah, it's quite interesting. But then also, like at the moment, I think we probably all agree that the graphite market is in quite a tough spot at the moment. And it does feel like we've been in this kind of situation for the last, well, maybe 3 years. However, kind of based on your experience, kind of when do you expect the market to turn, and kind of what indicators or kind of developments are you kind of watching out that could signal a reversal?
Well, there's obviously this tariff situation has gotten everybody kind of upside down, trying to figure out where the world is, and get a I'll say a balanced view on the world. Um, but if you start to think about it, if if you have a slump in the graphite market, which we have, uh, and all of a sudden, here in North America, the graphite anode producers have asked the government to put a 970% um, duty on graphite coming in. Well, that would change the world, and if the government agrees to that, that would change the world in a heartbeat. And all of a sudden, the price of graphite in North America, and for people that can supply into North America at a reasonable level, would make a huge change. It would be a major shift. Same thing goes for the graphite electrode industry. Graphite electrodes, historically, there's been very few duties coming in. The Indians had a duty on small diameters of about 25%, and the Chinese had a duty on all electrodes coming in of 25%. As we move forward, now we're talking about the Indians would have 25% duty on small diameter, or excuse me, 50% on small diameter and 25% on large diameter. So the overall price of graphite electrodes, I expect in the US is going to rise up 20 to 25% very soon. When you look at Chinese electrodes coming in, they have a 25% duty. They now, as of I guess it's going to be May 2nd today, they have 145% duty. So now we're talking, or maybe it's 170%. It's hard to keep track. But that will effectively preclude them from shipping in as far as that goes. So if the market is $4,500 a ton here in the States, or let's say it's $5,000 a ton, in order to get into the market under that duty tariff regimen, they'd have to sell their electrodes for about, I don't know, 1,000 to 1,500 bucks, and that's not viable. So you're going to see big shifts, and you'll see then big regional shifts that go on. And I know Europe is looking at duties relative to the US, but they're also looking at duties relative to China and India. So we're going to see a lot of push and pull that goes on for a little while until things settle out and people can really understand what's happening. Typically, what I've seen in the past, that the EV industry is new, so there's no real history to it. But the graphite electrode industry is tied to steel. Steel is typically cyclical on about a 5 to 7 year cycle. And so in 2016, we went through a low period, and in 2016, the steel industry took off. And here in the States, people had gotten so used to having plenty of electrodes at very low prices that they didn't have contracts in place, and a lot of them didn't have contracts in place. A lot still did. But what happened was literally almost overnight, as the electrode guys were losing money. They're like any other business. When you start losing money, what do? You cut costs, you reduce inventories, you reduce work in progress, you reduce everything you can to try and get yourself in the best possible financial position. And so here comes the steel starts to tick up, and steelmakers said, "Oh, I need more electrodes." And they pick up the phone and they say, "Hey, send me a truckload of 18-inch that had been selling for about 2,200 bucks a ton." And they call and they say, "Send me a load of electrodes of 18-inch." And the electrode guy said, "I'm sorry, you don't have orders on the books with us, and we don't have any inventory for you." "Oh, come on, yeah, I know you do. You guys always have inventory." "I'm sorry, we're losing money. We've cut our inventories to the bone. We don't have any inventory for you. For the guys that have contracts with us, we have inventory. But for you, you didn't put a contract up with us. You played the market." And so then that guy calls the next electrode guy and the next electrode guy, and pretty soon he's got no possibility of getting a truckload of electrodes. And this happened. This is a real example of a purchasing guy, who did that. He played the market like that. And when he finally found a truckload of electrodes, instead of paying $2,200 a ton for it, he had to pay $25,000 a ton for that truck. But he
Wow.
needed it in order to
Yeah.
keep his mill going.
Yeah.
And so after that, he put contracts in place, and he made sure that he never had a shortage of electrodes. But what that did was it drove the price from 2,200 up to around global market price got up to around $15,000 a ton. And it settled back over time. Now it's back down probably around 4,500 to 5,000 bucks a ton. But those are the kind of things that can happen very quickly when steel turns up or aluminum turns up, or if batteries slow down for a little while right now and then they turn back up, you'll see shortages come through the supply chain. And that ends up, it's purely supply and demand. If you've got
Yeah.
too much supply and not enough demand, prices go down. And if it turns around and demand gets up and supply is not there, the prices will skyrocket. So
Yeah.
with all the turmoil we see in the market today because of the tariffs and the geopolitical issues, I fully expect at some point we're going to see some of these very high prices come back in certain areas.
Yeah, no, it definitely feels like there's kind of a few factors in the works at the moment that could, yeah, kind of improve the
Yes.
overall graphite market. But yeah,
Yes. To
namely
be
the
politically
geopolitical
correct, we just
situation.
say, yeah, to be politically correct, we just say there's geopolitical
Yeah,
things happening in the world right now.
exactly. Cool. Well, no, it's been great to chat, Tom. I appreciate you kind of coming on the series and yeah, chatting
Yeah,
about all things
no
graphite
problem.
related.
All right. And I wish
Yeah,
you well with Graphite Hub. I find it to be a very useful tool for me as I look at it and watch it to try and understand if I'm missing something in the market or if there's something changing in the market. It's very helpful. So
great. Well, no, yeah, appreciate your support. So thank you.
good.
Cool.
All right.
Cool. All right.
Thanks,
Well, thanks
Harry.
for tuning
Appreciate it.
into this episode of Graphite Hub's interview series. We'll see you next time.